Welcome to The Baton, a John Williams musical journey. Join host Jeff Commings as he takes you through the career of the illustrious film composer John Williams, starting with his debut in 1959 through more than 100 films in 60 years. And here's your host, Jeff Commings.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. In my last episode, when I detailed the history of the rarely seen film Story of a Woman and its rarely heard score by John Williams, I had the pleasure of working with my first co-host, John Maria Casquetto. I had so much fun that I wanted to do it again right away, and I'm glad to bring in my next guest co-host for this episode, Yavar Moradi. Welcome to the show, Yavar.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. I'm excited to do this.
So many of you might know Yavar as co-host of the podcast called The Goldsmith Odyssey. He's one of three hosts that are kind of doing the same thing that I'm doing with John Williams' career, taking a chronological analysis of the filmography of the late and very great film composer Jerry Goldsmith. Yavar, tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I was introduced to film music thanks to a bunch of VHS recordings that my Persian immigrant father recorded off TV in the 80s. So I had this legacy of ancient those EP 8-hour long tapes chock full of classic Hollywood movies, like a lot of swashbucklers and westerns. And it just kind of seeped into my psyche. And later on as a teenager, I realized that film music was a thing, and I started paying attention to names like Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, and, of course, Star Trek and Star Wars were formative for me, like they were for many people when it comes to those two composers. And I've just always been an enthusiast and lover of orchestral music, both for film and the concert hall. I got into that greatly, and in terms of for fun and also professionally, I've worked for a number of performing arts organizations over the course of my career. And about a year and a half ago, some friends and I decided to start a podcast on Jerry Goldsmith's work and do this chronological approach. And I kind of assumed that it had been an inspiration for you starting your own, but I was wrong. It was just great minds think alike, and we had a similar idea.
Yeah, it really was great minds think alike, because all I wanted to do was just make sure nobody was doing this for John Williams. I didn't think to find out if anybody was doing this for other composers. And then after about maybe 3 weeks, somebody had said, "Oh, you're doing the same thing as the Goldsmith Odyssey." And I said, "What's that?" And I've been hooked to it. I've learned a lot more about Jerry Goldsmith than I thought I ever could learn about it, which is kind of what I hope to convey to readers about, or the listeners about, John Williams. So, we're kind of doing the same thing along parallel tracks. And most of you probably do not know that Yavar actually has a big role in the creation of some of the episodes in this podcast. And I've got to thank you for this, Yavar, because without you, I would not have added John Williams' scores for the 2 TV movies he did to this podcast. That includes the 1968 film Heidi and the movie we're going to talk about today, the 1971 movie adaptation of the Charlotte Bronte novel Jane Eyre. Now, Yavar convinced me to discuss these scores, and rightly so, because the movies were originally made for theatrical release in the United Kingdom, and mostly because Yavar counts Jane Eyre as his favorite John Williams score. So before we start talking about the movie and the music, Yavar, I think the listeners would like to know why this is your favorite John Williams score.
Well, first, I think it's maybe a little important to note that even though these were TV movies in America, they were pretty prestigious productions. It was a feature film director that Williams had worked with on Fitzwilly, I believe, and they weren't maybe as big budget as a lot of Hollywood films were, but they were released theatrically, not just in the United Kingdom, but elsewhere in the world. As I understand it, actually, there's a dub of it in Chinese that was a huge hit in China, and you can go find that version on YouTube. So they're very worthy scores, and I think in some ways they are like a little more mature than some of what he was doing in films that were theatrically released in the United States in the 60s. So I think these were kind of a maturing experience in terms of his film output. Maybe he had a little more leeway on them, maybe because it was a familiar collaborator, or maybe because, there was a little less scrutiny on him as an up-and-coming composer, and he was allowed to do more in these kind of more under-the-radar releases. But he was primarily known, as you've been digging through his output, for his comedy scores in the 60s. And, he had a couple of westerns, and some stuff like None But the Brave is dramatically powerful work earlier. But I just think, for me, that Jane Eyre was a huge leap forward in terms of the maturity of his work. First of all, it's just flat out beautiful. The main theme, and I would say the Rochester theme, even though it's a little mysterious, and just the orchestrations and everything about it has this pastoral English feel that was, I think, close to Williams's heart. He was an Anglophile, and he loved the music of Vaughan Williams and other British composers, and he felt a strong kinship, I think, with that style, and I think he felt drawn to this story. And so I think he really recognized it as the opportunity it was, and there's kind of a sadness I like about it, and sometimes it's even a little creepy in a cool Gothic way. So it really was unlike any feature Williams had composed previously, and it gave him a huge story canvas, and he wrote something of, in my opinion, much greater depth and subtlety than he had been able to do at that point. I haven't dug into all of his obscure TV work, but in terms of his feature work, I'd say the closest he got to it was None But the Brave. So having that role as kind of this earliest composition as the fully mature John Williams we all know and love has resulted in it being so influential on a lot of subsequent scores. I'm thinking of stuff just later in the 70s, even like Family Plot for Alfred Hitchcock, or Images for Robert Altman, or at the very end of that decade, Dracula feels like almost the flip side of the coin when it comes to this score. And later on, even in some of his scores of just the past couple decades, you hear echoes of it in popular scores like Star Wars Attack of the Clones, where the love theme Across the Stars feels very influenced by it, and also Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban with its harpsichord writing and, general kind of English influence again, and kind of like that older feel.
I completely agree with all the films that you mentioned that are influences from Jane Eyre, because I did hear a lot of it, and I'm going to talk about one of them in particular. So when we were planning out the recording of this episode, Yavar, you told me that you had never seen the film until you decided to join me on this episode. So now that you've seen the film, how has your enjoyment of the score changed?
Yeah, I guess it's a little something of a lost film, maybe not forgotten, but it certainly hasn't been preserved in good quality. The version we both watched was on Amazon Prime, and it has the gall to call itself digitally remastered, and it looks really bad. Like, you can tell is just like a VHS copy or something like that, and the sound isn't great, but it's enough to really appreciate the film, I think, and especially the score within it, despite those issues. In terms of my appreciation for the score, I was really glad to have the excuse to, the impetus that is to watch the film, because I feel like it's a more rich and varied score in the film. There's, in particular, a lot more of the, not exactly horror, but darker music. Sometimes it veers on horror music, and it really sounds like some of his music for Dracula 9 years later. But in general, just the creepier, the more spooky stuff is on the album a little bit, but it gets developed a great deal more in the film version. Getting that extra context musically was really helpful, and I would love for a new recording of this full thing to be produced sometime, because I think a lot of people would maybe open their eyes to the depth of it a little bit more.
I counted 11 film adaptations of this movie from 1910 to 2011. as well as 3 musical stage productions. I think this has to be the most adapted novel in history.
I mean, there are a lot of contenders, but this one's certainly up there, and that's not even counting miniseries and, stuff like that. You're right, there's a lot of versions.
I mean, none of Shakespeare's plays got this many film versions. I mean, Romeo and Juliet doesn't have 11 adaptations. That's weird.
No, not quite.
And none of Bronte's contemporaries, including Jane Austen, got their novels put on film as much as this. Including the version we'll talk about in this episode, I've seen 3 versions of Jane Eyre, but they were all from the 2000s forward. So it's interesting to see, I guess, an older take on it, not from the 2000s. It looks lived in. All the sets look lived in. They don't try to make it look like they were constructed. Everything feels lived in this movie. And I think that's why I think this is the best version that I've seen. And it certainly helps to have the talent such as Susanna York and George C. Scott in front of the camera. And perhaps knowing John Williams did the music affected my enjoyment of the film, though.
I like this version of it, but I wouldn't say it's flawless or the best version I've seen, just because I think that, maybe I'd reassess it if there was a new restoration of it, but I felt like some of the chemistry was lacking a little bit between the 2 leads, even though they're both great actors in their own right. And George C. Scott, I don't know, seeing General Patton, immediately after Patton in a dashing romantic role was a little bit weird casting to me, and he's an American, so he stuck out a little bit for me, and I don't know, it's a little bit of a blemish on what is otherwise a very good adaptation.
Well, as you said, the version of Jane Eyre that we're discussing today was slated for a theatrical release in England in December 1970, and as you said, it went out to China, and I'm anxious to find that Chinese version. And it was a big hit, but I don't think there was ever a plan to put it in American theaters, at least from what I could tell, because English period pieces at the time were not as popular in the U.S. as they are now. So straight to American TV screens it went in March 1971. And Yavar had already mentioned that the director of this was Delbert Mann, the Oscar-winning director of Marty, and he was coming off successful work directing Heidi in 1968, which featured music by John Williams. And after he worked with Williams on Fitzwilly and the following year on Heidi, it's no surprise that Williams was going to be asked to score Jane Eyre. Mann and Williams enjoyed such a great relationship in the beginning that Mann wanted Williams to be the composer for all of his films. Williams took the assignment to write music for an episode of the CBS Playhouse anthology series that was directed by Mann in late fall 1968. After that, Mann directed an adaptation of the novel David Copperfield into a decent TV movie in 1969. John Williams was supposed to write a score for that film, but he was asked to work on Mark Rydell's The Reivers instead, and I think we can all be grateful for that decision.
Yeah, because it led to the whole rest of his career and relationship with Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that film, David Copperfield, actually got a really good score by Malcolm Arnold, so it was like no big loss there either.
So again, if you're unfamiliar with the connection that we're talking about here with the Reivers and John Williams' career, I urge you to go back a couple episodes back in my podcast, and you will truly understand the importance of that score. So Jane Eyre marks what I think is a first for John Williams in that he visited the locations where Jane Eyre was about to be filmed in the English countryside. And the usual practice for a composer is to wait until he or she sees the finished film, mostly because they're busy with other projects. John Williams has even said that he prefers not to be affected by visiting the set of a film or reading the book on which a film is based. But we know that he would do that many times after this. We remember he famously visited Tunisia during filming of Star Wars, and he read the Harry Potter books before he was even asked to work on those.
I think it's a case of Williams being an Anglophile and probably admiring the novel. And I'm just surmising here, but he was probably really excited by the assignment and, eager to get a feel for it early on and start coming up with ideas.
Right, because at the time, he was just finishing up work on conducting the song recordings that would be used for playback during filming of Fiddler on the Roof in summer 1970. I want to talk about the recording sessions because they took place at Anvil Studios just outside London, which he was already there recording for Fiddler on the Roof. So since he was already entrenched at Anvil and would be using the studio for more recording sessions for Fiddler, it was only natural that Williams would pretty much use the same orchestra for Fiddler for Jane Eyre that October. Now, Anvil has a compassionate place in John Williams' heart, I'm sure, because that's where he recorded a lot of his scores in the early to mid-'70s, including Star Wars, and then in the late 70s with Superman and Dracula and a few others. Unfortunately, Anvil would be demolished in 1980, but they moved over to Abbey Road to do some more scores in the 80s with the London Symphony Orchestra. So John Williams just loved being in London, and I think, he was a true Anglophile, and that really showed in this score and the fact that he kept going back to London to record his film scores.
And he also, even though he wasn't working with the full LSO at this time, he started establishing some relationships with instrumentalists in London, and one of them was a superb flute soloist who performed on this score, Peter Lloyd. He was the principal flutist for the London Symphony, and I think it was an important relationship that he started here. And some of the flute solos in this, you can tell he was writing for a virtuoso. You know, it reminded me a little bit of Prisoner of Azkaban, like when there would just be some ridiculous solo passage that spotlights the instrument, and you realize he was composing it for a person that he was familiar with their abilities on.
We're going to talk about some of those flute passages. They're just absolutely stunning. I marvel at them. So before we talk about this music, Yavar, I'm going to give a quick rundown of the plot so that people kind of get an idea of what the story of Jane Eyre is.
Sounds good.
We first meet Jane Eyre as a young girl arriving at a school for girls in the English countryside. The school teachers mistreat her and make her an outcast. Many years later, as an adult, Jane leaves the school to take a job as a governess to a French girl who has been taken in by Edward Rochester, a friend of the girl's mother. Jane and Edward soon become attracted to one another. Edward tries to keep a secret from society and hopes to marry Jane despite this secret. The two are exchanging vows when a man disrupts them. It turns out that Edward is married to a mentally unstable woman, and Jane runs away in anger. She collapses in a field and is cared for by two women and their brother. Eventually, Jane returns to Edward to find his home burned and Edward blinded. Jane stays by Edward's side, and they, presumably, marry and live somewhat happily. So, Yavar, you talked about how you kind of had issues with George C. Scott, and you talked about him playing George Patton. This was the film he did right after filming Patton, and his performance as Patton earned Scott an Oscar, which he famously refused on April 15th, 1971, 3 weeks after Jane Eyre played on TV screens across the United States. All right, Yavar, let's get to the music.
Sounds good.
So, John Williams gives us an introduction to Peter Lloyd and his flute right away in the film's opening. And the flute comes in during what we're calling the theme for Thornfield, the house that belongs to Edward Rochester, before the string section develops it into different thematic material. Peter Lloyd and his flute return a little bit later to give us Jane's main theme after that. Now, Yavar, I know you would prefer to call Jane's theme the love theme, but as I'm going to talk about later, I think it's not really a love theme. But no.
Why is that?
Well, it doesn't really fit kind of their romance, and especially because it's used later when Jane runs away.
I think that's not enough justification to disqualify it as a love theme, because I'd point out the famous usage of Princess Leia's theme, which you'd call the love theme from Star Wars. When Luke watches Ben Kenobi get cut down, John Williams doesn't always do a literal leitmotific approach. Sometimes, he will use what feels right. But I would also make the argument that in that scene when she's left him and is traveling away from him, her thoughts might still be with him. So that might be a reason that their love theme is playing then. But we can get more into that when we tackle the plot.
So no matter how we describe it, I really like this theme because the notes are on this ascending scale that seem to suggest happiness, even though there's going to be a lot of grief and sadness in Jane's life. Now, when I first heard this theme, I immediately heard similarities to the love theme from Attack of the Clones, which John Williams would not write for about 30 years. With that ascending scale, and even though it has even some similarities to the main Star Wars theme, that kind of the little ascending and rising scales.
I think that's actually when I first heard of Jane Eyre. This wasn't one of the first Williams scores I was introduced to, but I think when Attack of the Clones came out, all the people on all the older Williams fans on the message boards were raving about Jane Eyre and saying, if you really like this theme, you should go listen to Jane Eyre. And I did, and I fell in love with it. And now it's my favorite Williams score.
So, what do you think of this main title music? How does it stand out for you?
It introduces a lot of material very quickly and efficiently, but also not in a rushed fashion. I think it's a brilliant piece of work. The first half a minute introduces actually the mysterious long-line theme for Rochester himself on harpsichord. And we'll hear this later on in the album action cue to Thornfield, which was my favorite thing on the album, but it's actually not used in the film. More on that later. But it's followed after that first half a minute by an even more mysterious and ominous theme for the mystery of Thornfield Manor itself. And that's based on a 7-note motive that repeats and then varies a little bit and does some other stuff. So that's already in just the first minute, it's thoroughly established 2 of the main motifs of the score. And then there's an interesting section that you described as I believe a string section, developing it, and it seems to grow out of that Thornfield motif a little bit, but this motif that kind of does its own thing doesn't appear again in the score at all, so it's kind of just a one-off, really cool section, and Williams does a lot of interesting counterpoint here before he ultimately, again, just half a minute later, he introduces the love theme, or what I'm calling the love theme anyway. And for me, I guess most people would call that the main theme of the score, and I think it's maybe a little more emphasized on the album than in the film itself, because the album has a couple of concert arrangements of it. But to me, it's something of a love child between Nino Rota's love theme from Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet a couple of years before, and a theme he wrote for Romeo. It's worth mentioning maybe before we skip through that Williams fans should really check out the film on Amazon Prime, because of these early scenes of her growing up in Lowood. There's just a single track on the album of it, but there's actually a motif developed for that time that appears in 4 or 5 different cues, half of which are unreleased. And this is maybe another good argument for me arguing that that the love theme is not Jane's theme, because we don't hear it for her in these early scenes when she's growing up. It's not like it attaches itself to her immediately. The first time we hear it is when later on Rochester asks her to play on the piano, and she starts playing John Williams's love theme.
You've made a very convincing argument, Yavar. I am officially convinced that it is a love theme and not Jane's theme, now that you tell me, yes, you remind me it was not played when she was a young girl. All right, so there's a scene in her first night in Thornfield. There's a lot of mystery going on. She doesn't know who the man of the house is. There's a mysterious woman that's supposedly lurking around the house. And she hears a laugh outside her bedroom door and goes to investigate. Peter Lloyd's flute gives us the Thornfield theme, while the strings heighten the mystery of the scene as we see some strange woman in the hallway.
Yeah, this is a really cool short cue. It's not very extended, but it really ably assists this kind of creepy scene. And I'm glad you picked this one as something to highlight, because I'm pretty certain it's not on the album. On the album, the only music we really get that's kind of this creepy horror stuff is Grace Poole and Mason's Arrival, track 6. And this is an interesting, different development of that material, and really kind of unsettling in context. This cue that I want to highlight here, that I called The Meeting, I have no idea. Apparently the original cue titles were lost. I actually did get in touch with Lucas Kendall and Jeff Eldridge, who worked on that La La Land album, and they couldn't find any documentation. So this is one that would have to be reconstructed by ear and cue titles made up. But I chose this one because it's a substantial and kind of different development of Rochester's theme, unlike any other variation of it on the album. And it's worth noting that unlike the love theme, we don't actually hear the love theme, aside from briefly in the main title, before he asks her to play it for him. But we do hear Rochester's theme before he appears in this very cue. Before we've ever seen George C. Scott, Jane goes out for a walk and kind of watches the sunset, and it plays a variation of Rochester's theme. It's much less straightforward than its other appearances. It's kind of hesitant and unsure. And if I had to speculate, I'd say maybe it's because he's unknown to her at this point. She's only been able to kind of mentally speculate about him based on what other people have told her, and she's sort of been curious about who the master of the house is, and who rescued this French ward and everything, and they haven't actually met yet. So it's interesting that his theme has already appeared, and there's actually a beautiful swell of the theme in this cue as she's admiring that sunset during her wandering walk outside, and then we hear these strange kind of clop sounds that for a moment I thought were in the music, but then it's revealed that it's sound effects and it's his horse showing up and startling her. And interestingly, as soon as Rochester appears and we meet George C. Scott, his theme goes away. The second half of this cue is much darker and more ominous, and I guess it's maybe because she's meeting him under less than ideal circumstances.
Confound it, woman! What the devil do you think you're doing?
I was trying to move out of your way. Can I help you, sir?
You might fetch my horse.
Whoa, boy.
What is it you do to horses? Come on, come on. You should be home. Where'd you come from?
Thornfield, sir.
Thornfield. Not a guest, I think.
No, sir. Though it's clever of you to suppose that just from looking at me. I'm the governess.
You'd better get back before the dark comes.
Well, let's continue talking a little bit more about the dark moments of this movie and the score, because there's another scene I want to talk about that really I just want to highlight Peter Lloyd so much on this show because he is so good. And people who know anything about the John Williams scores that the London Symphony Orchestra has done that has any flute in it from now until even the prequel trilogy for Star Wars, Peter Lloyd did them, and it's really amazing to hear. So we've got to hear more of it. And he gets a lot of virtuoso flute playing in this scene that comes after a man named Mason comes to the house, and he's threatening to spill the beans on a secret Edward has that he's been trying to keep secret. And in the middle of the night, Mason screams, and he says a woman attacked him and bit him, actually. Williams first, he puts the string section to work as Jane hears this commotion on the other side of the door, most likely by this unknown woman. And Edward plans to sneak Mason out of the house to a hospital, and Peter Lloyd shows off his skills here with a wonderful flute run as Edward carries the injured man out of the house. And then we get the strong rendition of the Thornfield theme as Edward rides away in a carriage. So a little bit later, after he's healed, Mason comes back to stop the wedding between Jane and Edward because he does not want Edward to marry someone else, because he reveals that Edward's already married and the woman is his sister, is Mason's sister. For the music for this scene, John Williams brings in the horns, and then the strings and woodwinds provide some counterpoint, which I really like, as Edward tries to defend himself before taking Jane back to the house to meet his wife, who was the one who attacked Mason earlier in the film.
I saw her there last April. She's my sister. I'm sorry, Rochester, but it is not right.
My God, it is not right. Only right to condemn a man to eternal hell. You should see my wife. Would I owe you that much? And this girl. You should see her too, Jane. I insist. Come.
I like that you're calling out the horns here, because I forgot to mention them in the main title, but they are sort of a constant presence in the score, and they don't usually present themselves in a beautiful or romantic fashion. They're usually very low and threatening underneath, and they are one of the elements of this score that connect it so much with Dracula in my mind, because of how they're used in that score, and kind of makes them feel like two sides of the same coin a little bit.
Right. There's something kind of light and airy on the surface, but deep down, just like this secret, this secret's been hiding underneath, and all of a sudden the secret's revealed and the horns can say, here it is.
And that's just like what happens in the plot. So it's brilliant, psychological and deeper scoring than, just like a lot of the surface comedy stuff he'd been doing for most of the decade.
Right. We're going to get to what I call the most dramatic moment of the film, at least musically. This is when Jane decides to leave Edward after the revelation that he's already married. And she packs her things, takes off in a carriage to a destination that's unknown to us, and I don't know if even Jane knows where she's going. And I don't understand why the film cuts from her sitting in a carriage and riding off, and then all of a sudden she's walking through the English moors, stumbling through the fields. But it provides Williams with a wonderful opportunity to write some fantastic music. And once again, he brings out Peter Lloyd and his flute for what I think is a relieved version of Jane's theme or the love theme before things turn desperate when she's all of a sudden walking through this big storm. And that's when the strings take over and we feel Jane's desperation.
I will say that there were some times in this film where, to me, there were noticeable cuts. And sometimes they cut the music cues as well in really frustrating fashion, like they would just end something abruptly. And I wonder if there was maybe, because you said you didn't understand why the film cuts from her in this case. Maybe there was a little something snipped out for time or something like that. But it is a really powerful cue, and I agree that it well conveys the emotion, especially once the storm begins.
It's so beautiful, so romantic. I could listen to that cue. It's called Across the Moors, and it just highlights even more how much similarities there are to Across the Stars. And I think probably when John Williams was thinking of titles for the album for Star Wars Attack of the Clones, he probably thought, hey, this sounds like Jane Eyre. And I remember I did Across the Moors, and I'm going to do Across the Stars. I don't know, but it just was like when I saw the title Across the Moors, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So, as we said, Jane is stumbling through the moors. She gets caught in a storm, and she wakes up later, and she's being taken care of by two women, and then a priest in this village named St. John. They call him St. John in the movie, and it's
St. John.
Yeah, I love when they do that.
I've heard of St. John as a last name, but it's funny that his first name is not John, it's St. John and St. John, and it's kind of weird. Yep. But he does get a really great new theme. It's kind of a one-off. It actually appears in two cues, but I wanted to bring this up because it's a really good example of Williams making a concert version of a theme that presumably he didn't feel was developed enough musically in the film itself, but he made this more developed concert version for the album. And on the album, it's called Restoration, so a lot of Williams fans will be familiar with that cue. But in the film, it doesn't get that development at all. It's actually only given a couple of short appearances, which are both under 2 minutes long. So I think combined, they have less length than the entire album cue. And the first time it appears is... there's actually a brief interlude partway into the cue with the Jane and Rochester love theme as she remembers back on her life at Thornfield. And then the second time it appears, a little bit later, the theme that interrupts the St. John's theme is the mysterious Thornfield motif, not the love theme, as she gets a returned letter that she's sent. And then it immediately transitions to another in-film solo piano performance by Jane of her love theme with Rochester.
No, he just stood there stuttering, getting quite red in the face. Oh, poor Mr. Sutcliffe. He just likes you. Well, he doesn't like me, sir. He has been very Will you come and sit here and you can help me with some of these? Have you seen him staring at me in church? Finally, you go from one extreme to the other.
Good morning. I thought we might go for a walk. All of us.
Don't you think you walk enough miles in this parish, St. John?
I'd like very much to go.
I've found you some work. I doubt you'll like it, though.
I'll be the better judge of that when you tell me what it is.
She goes back to find Edward, and she finds out that Thornfield is burned to the ground because Edward's wife went a little crazy, jumped off the roof, and then in the ensuing chaos caused a fire and caused Edward to go blind when a burning timber fell on his face. And so Jane goes to find him in this place where I guess he's recuperating or where he now lives. I really like this reunion scene. It's better than in any of the versions of Jane Eyre I've seen. They really made it so tender. And even without the music, I really liked it. And this is, I guess, why I was okay with George C. Scott, because he really did bring a lot of tenderness to this.
I think this is his best scene with her. I agree. This is powerful. And I think a lot of it is due to the music, but he deserves some credit too.
Yes, a lot of it does have to do with the music, but George C. Scott really does his best here to kind of sell it.
I do want to point out that the film here features more music than the album, and it's the same recording as far as I can tell, but the album starts like a minute in almost to the cue as it starts in the film, and there's some really delicate scoring early on that is very effective and is kind of a shame it was left off.
Okay, so we get the love theme on the flute, and then there's the harpsichord that's playing underneath that plays Edward's theme. So this is another reason why I thought it was not really just a love theme. It was Jane's theme, and it was kind of like this blending of these two people finally, because they finally agree that they're going to be together, and musically these two themes come together and start to play off each other. But I agree that it could be a love theme, and just Edward's theme kind of going underneath, it was just perfect. I mean, I can't think of any better way to orchestrate that scene, because it needed to be soft and tender. And I'm glad that he really kind of let the woodwinds go with the flute, and then kind of put that harpsichord underneath to kind of make it pastoral. When Edward takes Jane's hand, the piano plays that love theme, and it's so perfect.
It's a really powerful ending to the score, and a great culmination of the musical development of the themes.
I could see why you count this as your favorite John Williams score, Yavar, and I could see why even John Williams continually calls this one of his favorites. I mean, the themes are extraordinary, and the orchestrations, not just Peter Lloyd on the flute, but just what he does as counterpoints to what is playing in the main part of the orchestra is just it. I've said it a lot. It's perfect.
I think it's really telling that if I'm not mistaken, this is the earliest work of his that he's regularly performed in concerts, and has re-recorded with the Boston Pops, a suite from and such. He doesn't do that with his comedy scores of the 60s. At least to my knowledge, and he doesn't even do it with None But the Brave, which is a pretty strong dramatic score, I think. But this one from 1970, which only aired on TV in the United States, he has a special love for, and I'm glad that he seems to like it as much as I do. Well, I already mentioned that really strong cue restoration from the St. John theme, but my favorite cue by far, and it was that way when I first heard this album, is the cue to Thornfield, which is a really thrilling action scherzo. It's less than 2 minutes long, but it uses the Rochester theme in a way unlike anywhere else in the score, and it doesn't appear in the film itself, which was maybe the biggest disappointment to me musically while watching the film. There is a cue early in the film that's unreleased on the album that I would have called To Thornfield when Jane is traveling to Thornfield, but it doesn't have the same musical quality at all. And I wouldn't imagine that he wrote the cue for that scene because it's not a fast-paced journey to Thornfield. So my speculation is that it's for after the thwarted wedding, when he's driving her back to Thornfield at that point, and I can kind of imagine this somewhat furious or impassioned, almost violent music accompanying a very rushed, dramatic carriage ride back to to show her his wife and reveal the situation, and at least in my head, that's what I'm imagining it underscores. Now, apparently, that section of the film, it was probably filmed, but it was cut before Williams got to score, got to spot the film, according to the liner notes anyway. So I can only speculate that he imagined writing music for the scene and had maybe even started composing it before he found out that that wasn't a scene he was going to be able to compose for. But he took the opportunity anyway, and he wrote this really thrilling action cue, which is very unlike the rest of the score, because there's nothing else quite with that energy. And then it cuts to them inside the house already. It obviously there was something missing there, I think. And I kind of wish they'd left it in, considering how good the music is, but maybe it wasn't shot that well. Maybe it was kind of boring, even with them, if they had given the music a chance to save it. Who knows?
Be that as it may, Jane Eyre was a very rewarding project for John Williams. I think we all have to agree with it, even if we've only heard it on the album. A year after the film premiered on American TV, the score was nominated for an Emmy in the category Outstanding Music Composition for a Special Program. And there were only 3 nominees that year. There was John Williams for Jane Eyre, Michel Legrand for Brian's Song, a great score, which I've heard. I love that movie, and Carl Davis for The Snow Goose, which is a film that I have not seen, never even heard of. Now,
he's a good composer, though. Yeah. Good competition, I bet.
Yeah, it was really good competition. So, though Brian's Song was the more popular film, I mean, it was watched by a lot of people. It was Jane Eyre that won the Emmy, giving John Williams his second Emmy Award in just 3 years. It was amazing. And since theatrical films were going to keep him busy for the remainder of the 70s and most of the 1980s, unfortunately, this was going to be the last TV project that John Williams was going to do until he wrote music for the 1984 Olympics. And unfortunately, it was going to be his final collaboration with Delbert Mann, who went back to TV up until the 1990s. He would work in TV movies up until the 1990s.
I agree. It's a shame they didn't collaborate again, but at least we got this one, and I think it was their greatest collaboration and also one of John Williams's greatest works.
All right, so that's going to do it for our discussion of Jane Eyre. Yavar, thank you so very, very much for being a part of the show and being my guest host today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. It's the first time I've been invited to be on somebody else's show, and I'd like to encourage people listening to this to check out goldsmithodyssey.com. Of particular interest to your listeners, I think, would be some of the works that Jerry did with John Williams as a soloist. And it's unsubstantiated, but we think that he collaborated by playing piano on Jerry's very first film score, Black Patch. So you could hear some of Williams's piano playing there, probably. And was definitely credited on City of Fear, and most importantly of all, the score to Studs Lonergan, where we really single out Williams's fantastic contribution as a piano soloist on that score. So check those out if you're curious or you have any interest in Jerry Goldsmith at all. I think you'll enjoy yourself.
All right, everybody. So let's close it out here. And on the next episode, I'm going to talk about Fiddler on the Roof. And a lot of you know this film, but you may not know a lot of the stories that come with John Williams' involvement with recording it before filming and after filming. And so you don't want to miss this. And I think if you're not a John Williams fan yet, I think you're going to be converted after hearing the stories behind the creation of this film and the score. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And until next time, the baton is down.